Our next keynote is themed What COVID-19 has or has not taught us on how to teach and think about data protection in Europe. It's about how the last 3 years of a global pandemic has influenced legal thinking and teaching, particularly in the privacy and data protection domains. More than 10 years after the presentation of GDPR by the European Commission in 2012, where are we in terms of data collection, data quality, data sharing, and interpretation issues? Our keynote speaker is Professor Nikolaus Forgo, Professor of IT and IP Law at the University in Vienna. He's head of the Department of Innovation and Digitalization in Law. It's great to have you with us, Professor Forgo. How are you? We'll give you, Professor, you are unfortunately muted. I will just wait 1 second and we'll make sure that we can also hear you. Perfect. How are you, Professor? But you are with us, so and no. So since October 2017, you're the professor for IT and IP law at the University of Vienna. How mature would you say is the question of data protection among private and public organizations?
I think, it has changed significantly. I've been doing this now for almost 30 years. And when I started with this, it was completely exotic and strange, and people did not really understand what I was talking about. That has changed quite significantly. However, I think data protection law is a little bit like tax law or some parts of criminal law. So many of the serious lawyers try to avoid it. And this is why I like it so much.
Because it's such an increasing, the importance of this field is increasing. I can see it clearly when I work, for example, in the private sector, how aware companies are of the threats and the need for protection. So I'll give the floor to you. And as always, we have a very curious audience, very talented audience who have great questions. If I can have the code for questions up perhaps on the sides for our physical audience, and then the QR code. And then for you watching online, as usually, if you go down from full window, full screen, you have the question window where you can ask questions. So at the end of your talk, Professor Forgo will have questions.
Okay, wonderful.
Thank you. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. As I said, I'm very excited to have the opportunity to talk to you about a very fundamental topic. And I will go back even more than to 2012 when GDPR was presented first to frame this presentation. I will go back to 1996. Many of the people in the audience probably were not born yet then. But it's an important moment in the history of internet regulation because in 1996, John Perry Barlow, one of the founding members of the Electronic Frontier Foundations, wrote a text in Davos in Switzerland at the World Economic Forum about the declaration of the independence of cyberspace. And this is, as many of you know, really a world-famous text, and there are plenty of good reasons why it's world-famous. And I would like to reread this text with you together today a little bit and put one thing into my center here, which is not that frequently discussed in this text from Barlow. This is the last set of sentences that I quote here, where he says that the governments of the industrial world have no legal concepts of property, expression, identity, movement, and context, and that those do not apply to this new cyberspace world we are in. And now the interesting part starts. All these concepts are all based on matter, and there is no matter here. And what I like to have a little bit of a closer look into is how context and matter might be related to each other, and in how far this has changed, or in how far this is on its way to be changed when we look into how COVID is treated with. So who is the person, who is the institution that is in control of the context of the environment or the phenomenons that we see? So when you look into the context of the internet, many of you know this better than I do. This is how the internet looked like in 2018. You don't need to see anything here or understand anything here apart from the fact that it's a quite different world from what Barlow saw in 1996. It's a world that is dominated by platforms, and none of those platforms in 2018, or almost none of them, is European. This has not significantly changed since then. The main difference between 2018 and 2021 is that there is one new player in the field, and this is the light blue one at the very end of this chart. That this is TikTok, being one of the new market entries with a lot of dynamic. Apart from this, 2021 is not that different from 2018, and it's therefore not that different from a report given by the European Network Information Security Agency in 2019, drawing a rather terrible picture about the European IT landscape, which is that Europe is in a way the patty of a hamburger. On the one side of this patty, you have the US-dominated software industry. On the other side, you have the Chinese/Asian-dominated hardware industry that is now in the process of also entering software. I remind you of TikTok. And Europe is somewhere in between. So this is one of the problems we are facing. All of you are very much aware of this, and all of you are very much aware of that this is a topic which is on the top priority of every single European Commission since at least the last 20 years, including the one that is in action at the moment. When you read the very, very first paper of Ursula von der Leyen ever written in her new role as then candidate for presidency of the European Commission, this policy paper, her digital or her agenda for Europe, you will notice that there is a whole page on digitalization or the digital environment and how this needs to be changed under her guidance. And when you read this page 13, and you should do so if you haven't done so yet, because it has a lot of very interesting information in it. When you read it, then you see a statement in there which says, on the one hand, that it might be too late for Europe to replicate hyperscalers, but it is not too late to achieve technological sovereignty in some critical technology areas. And on the other hand, you find the statement there that GDPR is one example where we as Europeans have already achieved something. So what von der Leyen is stating here is, in order to release the potential to regain digital sovereignty in Europe, we need to find our own European way, which is to balance the flow and wide use of data while preserving high privacy, security, safety, and ethical standards. And we as Europeans have already achieved this with GDPR. This is one of her key statements. So first statement, we need to gain momentum in Europe. Second statement, we need to find our European way. Third statement, GDPR is a good example that we can use here as an orientation point. I could give a presentation now, and I would be very happy to do so, where I could raise some of concerns or some of doubts about this. And I could quote people like the European Data Protection Supervisor, who in 2022 also started to raise some concerns about the success story that is constantly told about GDPR. But this is not my topic today, so I need to delay this presentation for another opportunity. My topic today is COVID, and in how far COVID has something to do with what I've been telling you so far. And I think it has a lot to do with what I've been telling you so far, and I will use the next 10 minutes of this presentation to develop this a little bit further. So the first thing that I would like to state here for that purpose is one of the things that COVID taught us is COVID is a data phenomenon. It's all about data, and it's about the question what these data mean. So what does data about this pandemic tell us, and who and how are these data then used to transform those data into something which has an impact on how we deal with such a catastrophic event like a pandemic. Von der Leyen, as you remember, says that GDPR might be a guiding principle here that might be useful because of course, a lot of the data we are talking about when we talk about a pandemic is personal. At least everything at the beginning, at least, is personal. A lot of it is sensitive, and therefore this balance of flow on the one hand and high standards on the other hand should have been successfully followed in this context. However, my diagnosis now after almost the third year into this pandemic is Europe has not really been that successful, and in particular my home country, Austria, has not been particularly successful in finding this right balance between the different interests von der Leyen is referring to here. And I could again give another presentation here for another 2 hours, giving you many, many examples on why I think that this was not really that successful. I need to limit myself to one single example here. And this example brings us back to March 21st, 2020. So just to remind you of the context, this was the first week of the first lockdown in Austria. Everyone needed to stay at home. People were upset. People were in a real crisis mode. And people started to buy food and toilet paper and whatsoever and to store it at home for a fundamentally challenging situation. In this moment, the Austrian legislator did a lot. He decided on a lot of laws. One of them was about how data about this disease, about this completely new disease, should be treated and should be transferred within Austrian borders in order to fight that pandemic. So one of the topics already dealt with in March 2020 was how should we guarantee that people who need to know about this data know about this data? The answer was given in a law. This is the Austrian e-health law, Gesundheitstelematikergesetz in Austria. And strikingly, the answer was, well, if we are talking about such a crisis like COVID, no worries about data privacy, no worries about security in particular, no worries about reliability, etc. It's sufficient to start to transfer data using fax machines or email. So the answer to this question was send your COVID data via email. And it remained like this until the 30th of June of this year. So more than 2 years, the status quo of how to deal with personal COVID-related data in Austria was feel free to send them via fax or via email, no matter that, of course, all kinds of problems with this concept that lead back even more further away from us today than John Perry Barlow's text. In this case, this cartoon that most of you know is from 1993. No matter that all this, of course, was then heavily on the table, it was quite evidently an issue here that this email solution might cause problems. So GDPR would have been and could have been something to assess this concept again. However, this was never really done. It was never really done until today for a very simple reason, which is very similar, I assume, to many of the situations of many of the other European countries that are present at this conference. And this situation looks like this. This is the IT landscape of the Austrian electronic health data, set of data. And you don't need to understand anything about this chart apart from the fact first that it does not really look very well structured, and second, the human or the data subject is not really in the center of this drawing. And this obviously leads to all kinds of unfortunate follow-up problems. The first problem is that as the landscape is so disrupted and uncoordinated, it allows all kinds of alternative facts to enter the scene, kinds of interpretation of data that cannot really be properly controlled because the data landscape is so unstructured and unclear and hidden in silos. And second, it then also leads to all kinds of alternative legal answers based on these alternative factual assumptions. This is the core of my presentation here. My argument here is, as we have not succeeded in properly structuring health-related data, despite 10 years of GDPR and despite 30 years of IT law in Europe, the outcome of this is a very unfortunate mixture of alternative facts and alternative law coming out of this. One example of many that I could give you, a very, very recent example. This is a tweet from Austria's health minister from yesterday. He was arguing that due to the fact that the virus load in the wastewater in the country is currently failing, no further actions are needed at the moment. There is plenty, of course, of interesting questions here about wastewater and who is in charge of data quality, data control, data security, and all these assumptions and in all these scenarios. This is not my point here. My point here is that this is what people did with this statement then. They, of course, started, as in any other COVID scenario I was ever in charge of in the last 3 years, people started to question this assumption, whether it's really true that the wastewater virus load is decreasing, and what then should be the legal answer to this. This is just one example, as I state. I'm quite sure that many of you are aware of many, many other examples of such alternative facts and then alternative legal answers coming out of this, although the legal question is in principle very simple. It's about what would be the most efficient, the most justifiable, the least human rights intrusive response to a pandemic. And this answer to this question obviously relies on context, as Barlo put it, and the context relies on data and the reliability of the data. Example 2, just very briefly, as many of you are Swedish, I could do the same exercise that I just did with Rauch, our Minister of Health here in Austria. I could do the same exercise with an example in Sweden. All of you certainly know this rather famous analysis of the Swedish way, how to deal with the pandemic, putting again this issue that the figures and the data set behind the answers given are to be challenged, putting this quite into the center. So when you're reading this article, this issue about data control and data manipulation and statistics and who is in charge of dealing with the interpretation of these data is again very much in focus. So just to be precise here, I don't know anything about the Swedish situation on COVID. I mean, apart from what I read in the news, and I don't want to give any comment about the Swedish answers given to the pandemic. My only comment here was or is that in principle, this problem about putting data into context and who is in control of putting data into context is key in every single country, possibly and potentially in Sweden, certainly also in Austria and in Germany. And for the Austrian and German situation, I can certainly emphasize that this question, who puts what into context, is a disaster. We don't know anything about the facts or the law at all at the moment because we don't know anything about who should and who could put the data into the necessary context. If this were true not only for Europe, but not only for Austria, but all over for Europe, then of course we would urgently, even more urgently than on a national level, need a European debate on this. And the European debate, this is the second important argument of this presentation. The European debate, in my view, is not really covering this with the priority needed here, although there is plenty of material out there which should be and could be challenged against this threshold from the Commission. The most prominent example here is this initiative to develop a European health data space regulation. As you know, this is a proposal from the Commission coming with a new act, a new directly applicable piece of law that should now more than ever focus on health-related data being established on top of GDPR. As this proposal literally quotes, it should be a horizontal framework that provide based on the existing horizontal network and framework. In addition, now a vertical framework for the health sector, and it should take into account the sensitivity of this sector, and it should help in supporting health data research and health data-based policymaking by providing, I literally quote here now, by providing a consistent, trustworthy, and efficient setup. And this efficient and trustworthy and consistent setup should be built on principles as we see them from GDPR and should lead into a situation that looks very much like this graph here. This is from a second document from the Commission that comes with this proposal. It should ensure, inter alia, the consistent and efficient framework for the reuse of health data for research, innovation, policymaking, and regulatory activities. So if there were a COVID situation in 2025 or 2028, this should be the instrument to help us with this, and it should be an instrument then governed by a central platform run by the Commission, and interpreting data and bringing data together coming from so-called health data access bodies, which would again be national institutions. So the idea here is to have national health data access bodies who would be framed by the Commission's work, and these health access bodies, health data access bodies, should inter alia support the development of AI systems. And I would like to invite you just to think together with me what could go wrong here based on the experiences that we had with COVID when such health data access bodies start to support the development of AI systems in the health domain. So to finish this, because I only have 20 more seconds to finish this on time, I would say there are two things which could possibly go wrong if we go further here without further fundamental debate about what had gone wrong with COVID and with public health decisions based on data in COVID. The first thing that could go wrong looks very much like this graph. This is from today. And this is a graph putting into question the amount of people dying with COVID in Austria today. So after 3 years of COVID, even this very fundamental point, which is, do we know how many people per day die with this disease, is challenged. We don't know. At least plenty of people argue that we don't know yet. And the second thing that could go wrong with the European health data space is this one here. This is again an Austrian example. This is the development of trust of the population into some of the fundamental institutions in this country. And what you see here is a decline, a fundamentally important and systematic, and every institution is affected by this decline of trust into the institution. The thing at the lowest end, these light blue dots, this is the national government. And the orange triangles above this is the European Union. So this is the second thing that could go wrong. We could continue with a decrease of trust into our basic institutions in an environment, I remind you, that looks from a technical point of view or a technological point of view like this. And that's it. Sorry for being so depressive and so depressing. Thank you very much. I'm very much looking forward to receiving your questions.
Thank you. We have a question from a participant from India. The context of the India debate is that data collection reside with government and country. It's interesting to know about Austria and Germany, and putting my question into the context of Indian debate, where data collection reside with government and country, where the country is on a nascent stage of digitalization. We have popular media articles misrepresenting the figures and so on. So, Professor, what are your comments on data handling, and what should activist researchers advocate for or against in India?
So thank you very much for this excellent question, because in particular, India is, as far as I know, a very, very good example, because India has been very active in starting to collect personal information under the impression of COVID. I had the privilege to have a very interesting debate on this with an Indian colleague just recently, and it's striking how actively India really tries to get their hands, or the government tries to get their hands on health-related personal data. I think the main message that I would really like to share with you on this is be careful, because you never know about the context this data is used in, neither in the political debate such as COVID, but nor in the further debate about how data should be used for secondary purposes outside the framework of COVID or any other health-related purpose. And we are not really in the situation at the moment where any of us has a clue about what could happen with this, in particular when we look into the developments that come with artificial intelligence. And I would be very, very cautious and in looking into the details of India here in a too optimistic way. So my answer would be, look into this, put it into context, and be a little bit of a warning signal about what could happen or what could not happen coming out of this data.
Thank you. Here is another question. I think you have to correct me if I'm wrong, that it's on the quality of the data in itself. What should we do with the COVID data? It seems to me, says the person asking the question, that there's an assumption that the data is fully reliable. But is it? The collection at the very starting point was based on other reasons apart from gathering cohesive and coherent data. So my question is, shouldn't we be asking if this data is really reliable or not?
Absolutely, we should. And this is, in my view, very important for a very simple fact, which is lawyers are not very good in assessing quality of data. They are not trained in this. It's not really in their focus, because understanding GDPR and other privacy laws is already complicated enough. So we are very, very used as lawyers, even back to the Romans. I could go here. We are very used in interpreting the law based on facts that are presented to us. And the problem here now with the data, with data in general and COVID data in particular, is that these facts, or in your example now, the quality of the data is not clear. It's not clear. It's not set that this is sufficiently structured and reliable in the sense of finding answers, legal answers based on these data. So my answer to this would be, we urgently need to train lawyers. Also, and in particular, we need to train lawyers to challenge the facts and to challenge the factual basis of the data their legal argument is based on, in particular, but not only in COVID. When you look into COVID data, every single data set that I ever saw a discussion about, any of the clinical experts started to challenge the quality of the data within 10 minutes of the debate. So it's really a crucial question.
One very quick answer here. What norms or levels of binding constitutional rules should one operate under, in contrast to mere recommendations?
Well, I think in particular, the Charter of in Europe at least, based on the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, that would be my starting point.
Let's see if we do have time for one more. This is a controversial one. Do you think academia or individual academics had a significant role in making the situation worse by over-enthusiastically selling their theories or carelessly interpreting data to get visibility? It's kind of a biased question.
It's a difficult question. So my assumption would be, like anybody else, of course, also scientists have an opinion about how to deal with a pandemic. And it was not always very easy to distinguish between their expert opinion based on a proper legal artis achieved interpretation of the facts and a political opinion that they gave like anybody else could have given them. And this is another very interesting question, I think, about how scientists and people of universities and experts should or should not behave in such a stressful situation. And I don't see too much of debate about this question either. And it's a very ethical question, putting a lot of the things that we as experts have not discussed yet properly, putting a lot of them into doubt and into being subject to be challenged, I would say.
With that, we have to end. My main takeaway, which you were very clear about, is put your data in context. Thank you so much, Professor Forgo, for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. All the best and have a wonderful afternoon.